Hey guys, Barrett here. Welcome back to another video. Today, we're talking about the Prince Response and the Prince Spectrum paddles. Stay tuned. Okay, so if you guys aren't already aware, Prince is a manufacturer of tennis rackets in the tennis world. Until recently, they hadn't done anything with pickleball, but earlier this year in 2018, they partnered up with Paddle Tech to make these babies, the Response and the Spectrum. Later on, I'm going to go into the differences between the two, but for now, let's look at the actual paddles, give you some of the specifications, and just give you kind of a general look as to what they look like. All right, so here they are, the Prince Response and the Prince Spectrum. Now, quickly, before we get into all the details, I'm going to sort of explain the differences between the two versions. It's really simple because I want to put this aside just so I can focus on one. This is the Response here, and this is the Spectrum. The only difference between these paddles is the length of the handle. Okay, so you should be able to see that pretty well. This is the Spectrum, this is the Response. The Spectrum handle is 5 inches long. The Response is 5.5 inches long. That's the only difference between these paddles. However, it does make a difference because if we line them up here at the top, so if we make them even, and we flip this over, we can see that the Spectrum underneath it, you see how you can see the paddle face underneath? That's because the paddles are the exact same length. They're lined up here at the top, but since the Spectrum's handle is shorter, you actually end up getting a little bit more paddle face. The same thing happens with the Selkirk Amped Epic and the S2. Both the paddles are the same length, but the handle is shorter, and thus you get more paddle face. So if you're thinking about either the Spectrum or the Response, remember that the Spectrum has the short handle, the Response has the long handle, and yes, that's Simone Jardim. She uses this paddle to great success, and interestingly enough, I only know like 2 or 3 other people in my area that use this paddle, but spoiler alert, as you can imagine, I absolutely love it. So let's get into some of the specs. Again, the only difference between the two is the length of the handle. Okay, so real quickly in terms of specs here, don't worry, we'll get into the shape in a little bit. Again, 5.5 inch handle. You have 2 versions when it comes to weight, as usual. The lightweight is 7.1 to 7.6 ounces, and the midweight is 7.7 to 8.1 ounces. However, when I got both of these in the mail, surprisingly, the Spectrum was actually like 8.2 to 8.3, and this was like 8.1 to 8.2, somewhere around there. So, not sure how that happened, but it's pretty standard to give people a choice between lightweight and midweight, but more about that later. There's a lot of important things I need to say about that. So height is 15 3/4 inches. 16, somewhere around 15.5 to 16 inches in height is pretty standard. The maximum height is 17 inches, like the Maxima that you have here. This is a max length paddle. In terms of width, interestingly enough, it's actually 8.25 inches wide. Oftentimes, like with my old Tempest Wave here, this is 8 inches wide. That's pretty standard for the industry, but this Response and Spectrum is 8.25, again, mainly due to this oval shape, which we'll get into. One of the other options you have when you're buying one is grip circumference. You can either do 4 1/8 inch, or you can do 4 3/8 inch. The Response here, so you can mix and match. So you can do a Spectrum with 4 1/8 or 4 3/8, or you can do the Response with 4 1/8 and 4 3/8. I prefer the thick grip. You may want to get a smaller, the sort of smaller circumference grip. The reason is because you can tape it a few times and you can get up to the thickness that you want, but I really like the thick handles. That's just my my priority. So of course, the most unique thing about this paddle is that it's not necessarily shaped like a tennis racket. However, it certainly has that feel to it. Let's start with the neck, the hosel, whatever you want to call this area. The way I typically explain this to people is I'll line up the Tempest Wave like this, and I'll sort of show people, if you can see, the response is underneath here. You see how it flares out from the neck? Let me try to get in close here. You see how it gets wider earlier? The Tempest Wave kind of comes up more, whereas the response widens out more. And so what this does is it helps people with mishits on the neck here. I have trouble with this sometimes. When I'm teaching my students, sometimes they'll try to hit with their hand. So instead of trusting the ball hitting in the paddle, they'll try to hit the ball with their hand instead, and they'll miss hit on the neck here. The great thing about this paddle with the shape is that it expands out sooner at the neck instead of sort of creeping upward and then going wide. Hopefully that made sense. If that didn't make sense, let me know in the comments and I'll explain more. Of course, the shape is so unique. I don't think we've ever seen this in a pickleball paddle before. What this does is it evens out the sweet spot. So instead of having these sort of rigid areas up in this corner, they're instead more rounded out at the top here. And also the more rounded out on the edges as well. And so what this does is it creates a more consistent sweet spot, and it gives you a little bit more forgiveness. But that's a general take on the shape of the paddle and how unique it is. It does make a difference, and let's get into that now. Okay, so the big question on a lot of people's mind is, does a shape like this actually make a difference? It is wider over here by like 1/4 inch, and the sweet spot is much more rounded out, which sort of goes along with the way the ball is shaped, you know, so you don't have these kind of like rigid corner areas or anything like that. Like I said, the neck is much more expanded. The paddle is much sort of wider in a way, because if you compare, you can see that the sweet spot here is much more round compared to here, okay? So does it make a difference? The answer, I think, is yes. It really does. I have noticed a significant improvement in my game, and especially on dink volleys. I don't know what it is. I haven't been drilling dink volleys, but for some reason, I'm just able to really get them with this paddle. And I think the reason is because when I'm dink volleying, I've got all this room. I mean, there's so much room on this paddle. So in terms of the oval shape, does it make a difference? Yeah, it does. It definitely does. No question about it. Now, here's what's really crazy about this paddle. The weight. When I got this paddle in the mail, when I lifted it up and I started to do this kind of thing, I thought to myself, oh, I must have ordered the wrong one, because I ordered a mid-weight paddle. So I thought, okay, I'll get an 8.2, 8.1, somewhere around there. I thought, oh, they got my order wrong. They accidentally gave me a lightweight paddle. Oh, well, I'll just take it back and get the right one. Well, no, I actually weighed it and it's 8.2. The thing is that it actually felt like a 7.6 or a 7.7. It felt like my old Tempest Wave. They feel the exact same way when you're doing this kind of thing. This is 7.7, this is 8.2. What that means is that the weight is more towards the handle rather than towards the top. So if in terms of performance, if you're someone that loves top-heavy paddles, you're the kind of person that puts lead strips up here at the top, or you're a previous tennis player, you use like the Engage Poach Advantage or the Paddletech Bantam EXL, or even like the Paddletech Element, you're probably not going to like this paddle. The reason is because a lot of the weight is more centered towards the bottom, like at the handle. So it feels very handle heavy. All the weight is here rather than being up here. So I've given this analogy before. Top heavy paddles feel like a hammer. you can feel all of the weight further away from your hand at the top of the paddle. Whereas this feels like all the weight is around here, sort of in the center. Now, I personally like that. I've never played tennis before in my life. Never played any kind of racket sport, so I don't know what that sort of top-heavy feeling feels like. But again, if you're that kind of person, and weight is one of the most important factors for how you pick a paddle, this may not be a very good paddle for you. But if you're the kind of person that doesn't mind, oh man, I think you're gonna love this paddle. Another thing I do with the weight is I'm using the Response, so it's 5.5 inches long, and I'm using the thick grip. Let me get in close here. Let me focus on the handle. How I do it is I get this meaty part of my hand. It actually has a name. I forgot the name of it. I get the meaty part of my hand and I wrap it around the bottom knob of the paddle like that. Now, as you can see, I have a lot of room right there. But what that does is it creates more distance between my hand, which is the angle point, right? The anchor point, you could say, and the center of gravity up here. So when I'm hitting shots, I have way more power and way more force behind the ball because I'm creating more whip and more sort of force on with my swing. So there's ways to kind of get around the fact that the paddle isn't very top heavy. If you just kind of use the length of the handle to your advantage like this, you can kind of get around those sorts of things. It can be kind of difficult to play with this paddle if you choke all the way up here like this. This feels like 7 ounces when you do it like this. So just keep that in mind when you go out to play with this paddle for the first time, if you choose to try it out. If you're the kind of person as well that tends to hit a lot of balls on the neck here or the hosel, this is probably going to be a really great paddle for you because, again, the way they designed it is that it expands out quicker before it goes up. So that can be a good option for you. So overall, I love this paddle. Yes, I have completely switched from the PaddleTech Tempest Wave to the Prince Response Pro. I absolutely love it. It's done amazing things for my game, and I can't wait to improve with it even more. Guys, I hope that you enjoyed this review. I hope that it was helpful. If you want to see more, of course, you can go to pickleballkitchen.com for more. I did write a review, actually. I'll link it down below. And let me know how this paddle works out for you. If you try it, let me know how it works. I would love to hear what you think. Leave a comment below and I will respond. Thanks, guys. I'll see you next time.